I'm Dusty Horwitt, Senior Analyst with Earthworks, and we are delighted to be co-hosting this event with Michelle's Earth Foundation. I grew up in Arlington and, like Michelle, graduated from HP Woodlawn. And we're proud to help carry on Michelle's legacy this evening. So the subject of the forum tonight is the potential for horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing for shale gas in the George Washington National Forest and the risk that this might pose to our drinking water here in Arlington and throughout the DC area. This issue is even more relevant in light of the recent chemical spill in West Virginia, in which dangerous and unknown chemicals were spilled into the river near Charleston. And so we'll talk tonight about how there's some similarities with hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, and how there are also dangerous and unknown chemicals involved in that process that could pose risks to our drinking water here in this area. I first understood how serious a risk horizontal drilling and fracking posed to drinking water supplies when I was invited to speak at a hearing several years ago in New York City. The New York City Council held a hearing on the risks that fracking and drilling for shale gas might have for New York City's drinking water. The city gets its drinking water from reservoirs up in the Catskills, and the Catskills and those reservoirs happen to sit on top of the Marcellus Shale, which is the same shale formation that underlies the George Washington National Forest. And so the city was concerned that this type of drilling and fracking might contaminate its water supply, which is unfiltered. It's one of the few cities in the country with an unfiltered water supply. So in the middle of this hearing, one of the New York City Council members said in his thick New York accent, "The purity of New York City's drinking water is absolutely critical to the great taste of our bagels and pizza." And I laughed, and I looked around the hearing room. No one was laughing. This is very, very serious for New York City, and of course not just because of the bagels and pizza. New York City's concern about this drilling process near its water supply is one of the main reasons that New York State has had a moratorium on shale gas drilling and fracking for the last 5 years. The state has estimated that just in the case of New York City, if the city's water supply were contaminated by fracking and drilling, the state or the city would have to build a water filtration plant at a cost of at least $8 billion, with $200 million a year to operate that plant. So very, very expensive proposition. So here in the George Washington National Forest watershed, there are many of the same concerns, and 3 of our area water providers, including DC Water, whose representative Nicole Condon is here tonight, Fairfax Water, and the Washington Aqueduct that provides drinking water to Arlington, DC, and Falls Church, have all written to the Forest Service asking the Forest Service not to allow horizontal drilling and fracking in the George Washington National Forest because of risks that might pose to the Potomac River, from which more than 4 million of us get our drinking water here in the Washington area. The Forest Service initially, in a draft plan in 2011, recommended no horizontal drilling and fracking in the forest, in large part because of water quality concerns. They then received comment letters from essentially the entire oil and natural gas industry. Exxon, Halliburton, American Petroleum Institute. I counted 14 different comment letters objecting to this draft plan. And since then, the Forest Service has publicly said that they might reconsider this draft and they might allow horizontal drilling and fracking for shale gas in the forest. And that's where things stand now. We expect that the Forest Service could make a final decision any time now. So this is a photo of the George Washington National Forest. This is Elkhorn Lake. It's part of the Potomac River watershed. This is in Augusta County, Virginia. And you can get a sense of how beautiful the forest is. It's not only a source of drinking water for the Potomac, it's also a source of drinking water for Richmond. It has the headwaters of the James River. About 500,000 people get their drinking water in the Richmond area from the James River. And it's also a mecca for recreation. About 1 million people every year come to the forest to hunt, fish, hike, camp. In fact, when I was here at the lake in the fall, there were a couple people fishing for trout in the lake. So about half of the forest sits on top of the Marcellus Shale. And this is a map of shale plays across the country. These are formations that oil and gas companies have been increasingly tapping for oil and gas. And as you may have read or heard, our oil and gas production has increased significantly, in large part because of drilling in these shale formations. However, this type of drilling does come with significant risks. So the formation that we're talking about in particular tonight is the Marcellus Shale. And you can see it's that eastern, it's the largest shale formation in the country. It's underneath primarily 4 states, New York, Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. And as you can see, the eastern edge cuts through the western panhandle of Maryland and comes down around the Virginia border. So here's a map of the George Washington National Forest. You can see the forest in green, and it's on top of the Appalachian Basin, which is illustrated with those dots, and that's right on the edge of the Marcellus Shale. This particular map doesn't show the Marcellus going quite as far as the Appalachian Basin, which is another related shale formation, but about half the forest is on top of the Marcellus, and that's where the companies could drill for natural gas. You can see the rivers too. There are tributaries, and this map does not show all the tributaries. There are many, many tributaries in those large tan watershed areas for the Potomac and the James. But you can see how the rivers look on the western side in West Virginia. That's the South Fork of the Potomac, flows up into West Virginia and then comes down toward D.C. And on the eastern side, you have the Shenandoah, North Fork, and South Fork. Those connect with the Potomac at Harper's Ferry and then come down to D.C. This is what our watershed looks like on the ground. This is a photo of the Dry River, perhaps incongruously named, in the forest. This flows into the South Fork of the Shenandoah and then into the Potomac and down to D.C. This is the North Fork of the Shenandoah, which also flows out of the Potomac, out of the forest, and then links up with the Potomac at Harper's Ferry and comes down to D.C. On the West Virginia side, you have the South Fork of the South Branch of the Potomac. And then, finally, this is the James River. This is the headwaters of the James that flows out of the forest and provides drinking water to folks in Richmond, Virginia. So why, you might ask yourself, why is it that fracking has become such a big issue now, and why are we talking about this issue tonight? Fracking, as some people have said, has become the new F word, and even though it's been around since the late 1940s, and there are a couple of reasons that it's become such a big issue now. One reason is that there's been a historic shift in the drilling industry over the last decade or so from conventional formations into unconventional formations. And what that means is, in a conventional formation, the oil and gas is basically in a pool underground, and you just perforate the pool with your drill bit, and then up comes the oil and natural gas. It's a little more complicated, but that's essentially how a conventional formation works. In an unconventional formation, the oil and gas is locked up in the rock, and it's spread over a much larger area. And so to tap these formations like shale is perhaps the most prominent, it is the most prominent unconventional formation. It requires a lot more drilling and fracking. And one of the phenomenon that we've seen is that drilling companies, because they're now drilling these new formations, are increasingly drilling where people live. And so, for example, this photo is from the Barnett Shale in Texas, and you can see, on one side of this wall, there's a typical suburban neighborhood, and right on the other side, there are natural gas wells. This is the first formation where shale gas drilling was pioneered in near Fort Worth, Texas. And now it's our turn to consider the risks of drilling and fracking as companies consider possibly drilling the George Washington National Forest. The other big difference, in addition to drilling much closer to where people live, is the scale of the drilling. So this is what a hydraulic fracturing site looks like in the Pennsylvania portion of the Marcellus Shale, and this is what a fracking site might look like in the George Washington National Forest. It takes an enormous amount of equipment and fluids to complete one of these so-called frac jobs. In the George Washington National Forest, the Forest Service estimates that companies will have to inject up to 5 million gallons of fluid underground, which is a mix of water, sand, and chemicals, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. They project that each well pad will include 3 wells, and that to service each of those well pads will require up to 4,400 truck trips, primarily to haul the fluid in for the fracking, and then to haul the wastewater back out after the fracking operation is finished. And just for point of comparison, New York State has found that back in the 1990s, when they considered the previous incarnation of drilling in more conventional formations, they estimated that there would be somewhere between 20 and 80,000 gallons of fluid injected in hydraulic fracturing. Today, New York State is estimating 2.4 to about 8 million gallons of fluid. It's about a 100-fold increase in the fluid that's injected in fracking operations, which is roughly consistent with what the Forest Service estimates for the George Washington National Forest, and that's because the companies need to pump down a lot of fluid to create very long fractures that access a much larger percentage of, or volume of the formation to get all that gas and oil that's been locked up in the rock over a wider area than in the conventional formation. Here is a schematic of what fracking looks like underground. This is generally what would happen if it were to proceed in the George Washington National Forest. So first, the companies would drill straight down, then they'd steer the drill bit horizontally. And that vertical leg of the well would go somewhere between 1,000 and 8,000 feet underground. Then they turn the drill bit horizontally and drill out about 4,000 feet. And they do that because the shale formations are relatively narrow underground. They run in narrow bands, and they want the drill bit to go right through the heart of that shale. If they just accessed it vertically, they'd only hit the shale at a single point, and they wouldn't be able to access very much volume of the rock. Then the companies perforate the horizontal leg deep underground. You can see the horizontal leg has those little sort of explosions in it. Those are mini explosions they set off inside the drilling pipe. It perforates the pipe at predetermined locations, which is where they want to fracture the shale. Then they pump down the fracking fluid, a mix of water, chemicals, and sand. It exits the drilling pipe at those perforations with such pressure, we're talking thousands of pounds per square inch, that it fractures the shale, freeing up the natural gas, or in other cases oil. And then they have to reverse the flow of the fluid, clear the drilling pipe. A portion of the fluid comes back to the surface where it has to be disposed of as wastewater. There are a lot of risks in this operation. One of the risks has to do with the chemicals that the companies use. Many of these chemicals are highly toxic. There was a congressional investigation conducted a couple of years ago by 3 members of the House of Representatives, Henry Waxman of California, Diana Paget of Colorado, Ed Markey of Massachusetts, and they asked the 14 leading oil and gas service companies to share with them their hydraulic fracturing products. They found that out of about 2,500 products, 279 of these products contained chemicals that were hidden as trade secrets. And so we don't even know in those cases what chemicals the companies are using. That's very similar to what happened in West Virginia, where a chemical spilled into the river near Charleston, and so little information was known about the toxicity of that chemical that public officials actually made contradictory statements about when that water would be safe to drink. In the case of hydraulic fracturing near our water supply, we could potentially be in an even worse situation because in many of these products, we don't even know what the chemicals are. And when these House of Representatives members asked the companies for more information, they were often told by the drilling companies that they purchased these fracking products off the shelf from chemical companies and didn't really even know the full list of ingredients. So the chemical companies were the ones keeping the trade secrets, and drilling companies in some cases were injecting chemicals that they weren't even aware of. Also, in addition to unknown chemicals, the chemicals we do know can be highly toxic. For example, companies often inject what are known as petroleum distillates into the wells. Those are things like kerosene, diesel, mineral spirits, Stallard solvent. These typically contain high levels of benzene, which is a known human carcinogen. And one of the risks if drilling were to proceed in George Washington National Forest is that some of these chemicals would spill and leak into headwaters of the Potomac and make their way downstream. Benzene is a very, very toxic chemical. It's toxic in drinking water, anything greater than 5 parts per billion. So a little bit of benzene goes a long way, and it would be very, very good to know what the other chemicals are that could be injected in this situation and in others, because some of those the toxicities of those other chemicals could be extremely high. One of the other risks is waste disposal. As I mentioned, at least about hundreds of thousands of gallons of wastewater will come back out of the wells. The wastewater can include the chemicals that are injected into the well. It can also include the naturally occurring water that's in the formation, known as produced water. And in the Marcellus Shale, the U.S. Geological Survey has found that produced water contains extremely high levels of radium, which is also a known human carcinogen. The Marcellus Shale is naturally radioactive. So the water comes up out of the well, and companies will have to dispose of it somewhere. And the question is where and how. And there aren't great ways to dispose of this water. In Pennsylvania, the New York Times documented how the companies for several years were taking their wastewater to sewage treatment plants that were not equipped to treat water with high levels, some of which were not able to treat water with high levels of radium. That water was then passed through the plants and then discharged into rivers which served as drinking water sources. A more recent study found that even in a case where an industrial treatment plant that was equipped to take radium out actually removed a significant portion of the radium, the wastewater that was discharged into a creek in Pennsylvania contained enough radium to pollute that creek with unsafe levels of radium in its sediments. It's very difficult to dispose of this water. One other technique that's probably the most favored in the industry is underground injection. That has problems when they inject water in the ground. It can leak, it can get into groundwater, and it can also trigger earthquakes. That's been an increasing problem throughout the country in places where drilling has been increasing. One other risk is underground migration of contaminants. This is a photo from the Barnett Shale. This is a gentleman named Steve Lipsky who lived in a home near where a natural gas well was drilled. The EPA found that the natural gas from this well was leaking into his water well, causing his water well to become flammable. There's a photo of him lighting his well water on fire. The EPA Inspector General was asked to investigate the EPA's investigation, where they went in and they found that the gas company was liable for, or was the cause for Steve Lipsky's flammable water. They took the gas company to court. They gave Mr. Lipsky clean water, and then EPA mysteriously pulled out and abandoned its enforcement action against the gas company. They stopped supplying Mr. Lipsky with water, but the EPA Inspector General found that EPA was in fact justified in stepping in, and that this was an actual case of gas migration into Mr. Lipsky's water well. Sometimes when gas migrates, it's not just the gas, but it can also migrate with associated contaminants like condensate, which is a naturally occurring hydrocarbon that comes up with the gas. There was a case in Colorado where a company named McCanna was fined a record amount by the state of Colorado for allowing an improperly drilled and fracked well to allow natural gas to migrate about 4,000 feet into a stream, where it contaminated the stream with unsafe levels of benzene. So this is another risk for our drinking water supply, underground migration of gas and associated contaminants, in addition to leaks and spills, in addition to disposal of the wastewater. And one last thing I want to emphasize related to that EPA case in Texas is that this is a very poorly regulated industry. The natural gas and oil industry has significant exemptions from most major federal environmental laws: Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, hazardous waste laws. the list goes on. So the EPA basically doesn't have the tools to protect us, and even when it does have some tools to protect us, we've seen several times in the last few years where EPA has mysteriously pulled out of investigations, like in this case in Texas, without much explanation. We also investigated state regulators, found that in 6 different states in 2010, 50% of all oil and gas wells were not inspected at all. So we are at least 50% were not inspected at all. So we don't have a lot of confidence that if this type of drilling and fracking were to proceed in the George Washington National Forest, that it would be regulated effectively. And it's not just these demonstrated cases of pollution that give us cause for concern. The drilling companies themselves, in their statements to investors, talk about inherent risks in drilling. Let's read a small portion of this, and then I'll turn it over to our next presenter. Chesapeake Energy is one of the leading shale gas drilling companies in the country. They're one of the companies that wrote a comment letter into the Forest Service saying, we think that you're unjustified in calling for a prohibition on horizontal drilling and fracking in the forest. This is what they tell their investors in their statement that they filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The natural gas and oil business involves a variety of operating risks, including the risk of fire, explosions, blowouts, pipe failure, abnormally pressured formations, and environmental hazards such as oil spills, natural gas leaks, ruptures, or discharges of toxic gases. If any of these should occur, Chesapeake could incur legal defense costs and could suffer substantial losses due to injury or loss of life, severe damage to or destruction of property, natural resources and equipment, pollution, or other environmental damage, cleanup responsibilities, regulatory investigation and penalties, and suspension of operations. Our horizontal and deep drilling activities, that's the kind that would occur in the George Washington National Forest, involve greater risk of mechanical problems than vertical and shallow drilling operations. And they also add that they had inadequate insurance to cover these damages. So it's no wonder that in light of these statements, the disclosure of risk by the companies, the demonstrated risks that we've seen, that not only have 3 of our major public water providers here in the DC area told the Forest Service not to allow this type of drilling in our watershed, but so too have many public officials, including public officials in the counties near the forest, Augusta County, Bath County, Botetourt County, Rockingham County, the cities of Harrisonburg and Stanton, Virginia, and then several members of our local congressional congressional delegation, including Representative Moran, Representative Connolly here in Virginia. So, in our view, and in view of many others, this type of drilling is simply too risky for our watershed and our water supply, as well as for the communities closer to the forest who would suffer other types of impacts, including truck traffic and the type of intensive industrialization that we saw in the photo of what a frac site looks like. So now I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Condon from DC Water, who will talk a little bit about the concerns that one of our major water providers has had.